Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia, and I am going to be moderating today's panel. So that means that I will be watching the time. And for the presenters today, I will be, the title of today's panel right now is Affective Attunements, Disability and Queerness. And we have three great presenters. And for the presenters, I'll be sending you a DM at 10 minutes, and then at 12 minutes, and then at 15 minutes, just to hopefully have time for questions at the end. And if anybody has any questions or just want to give love to the presenters, blow up the chat, please. Okay, I'm going to start with the first person, which is Mark. So let me grab, let's see. Hold on. Okay. So Mark, holding a bachelor's degree in intercultural communication from Linfield College, Mark Pereira has always been intrigued by the power to be found in stories. While pursuing his master's degree in women and gender studies, Mark continues to recognize and research this power, investigating the intersections of gender, sexuality, disability, and the student experience, all via narrative. Let's give it up for Mark.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. Before I do get started, I do have one quick question. For the Q&A section, will we be doing that as a full panel at the end, or will we be doing it individually after our talks?
Full panel.
Okay, cool. That's what I figured. So that is something to be mindful of. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So let me share my screen real quick. All right. Is everybody able to see that? Perfect. Thank you so much. So as mentioned, my name is Mark Pereira. I'm currently a master's student with the Women and Gender Studies program. Today, I'm going to be presenting on my thesis, which is The Resistance and Persistence. It's a narrative analysis on the academic persistence of university students with disabilities. One thing to keep in mind about this is I did want my work to be close to home. So it is all about students right here on UT Austin's campus. A few disclosures that I do want to make. All names that are included in this presentation, they are pseudonyms. They are not the students' actual names, and other key details have been obscured just for anonymity. The other thing to keep in mind is I am going to put a small content warning in here. One of the narratives that is included does have a reference to self-harm. So if that is something that you would prefer not to be witness to, it's just something to keep in mind near the end of my presentation when I do get into the narratives. There we go. So for today's agenda, there's a few things that I'm going to be going over. The first part is going to be the research background. What are previous findings on the subject? What compelled me to do my own work on this? Then I'm going to step into the research goals, what specifically I was looking for and what I wanted to contribute to the field. And then we'll do a short going over the research analysis of what I was looking at, how I was looking at it, and then we'll talk about the findings as well. Of course, the discussion will be with the full panel at the end, so I will take that section off and move it for later in this panel. The other thing to keep in mind is part of my work was looking at was creating institutional suggestions that UT Austin may be able to implement moving forward. But due to the time constraints of this that I have, that's not going to be something that I'll be able to delve in super in depth during my initial presentation. But if that's something that people are interested in, I'd be happy to go over that during the Q&A. So my research background, how did my work come to be? So one thing that I really wanted my work to do was to be close to home, hence why I located it on UT Austin's campus. And what I what it was really born out of was my previous experience as an academic advisor. What I was finding is that students on UT Austin's campus with disabilities were dropping out at higher rates in the conversations that I was having with them. One of my responsibilities as an academic advisor was speaking with students as they were traversing the university, whether that is physically, virtually, temporally, whatever the case may be. But when students were trying to withdraw from the university, one thing I noticed is that more often than not, students with disabilities were represented at a higher rate. And I wanted to address that. Some of the previous research supported what I was seeing. So as you can see here with some of the other findings, students with disabilities were not persisting at the same rate as their able-bodied and able-minded peers. One thing to keep in mind about this is that academic persistence is really closely tied to social integration on academic campuses. And disabled students generally enter higher education with a smaller social circle. That's because of the ableist structures that are baked into academia as a whole. A lot of disabled students choose not to put themselves in that situation and go alternate routes. The other thing that I really noticed is that existing scholarship on this matter mostly focused on statistics and quantitative patterns. There really wasn't a lot of attention that was given to the actual student narrative itself. So that is something that I really wanted to address. I wanted to find what experiences influence disabled students to stay enrolled at their university, transfer to another university, or drop out of higher education altogether. To do this, I wanted to hear from disabled students, and I really wanted the source of knowledge to be their stories, their feelings, their thoughts, their opinions. A lot of previous research focuses on statistics and quantitative outcomes, which kind of use the students as an object of inquiry as opposed to an actual source of knowledge. And that's something that I wanted to actively reject. I also wanted to look at the intersections of gender, sexuality, race, and disability, and how that all comes together in a student's academic experience. A common critique of disability studies in the past has been that it is predominantly focused on white people. And what I wanted to do was focus on identities that intersect in different ways and change the ways that we move throughout the world and academia. So what were my key interventions? Drawing knowledge from the student experience. Again, like I said, I wanted to view them as a source of knowledge as opposed to an object of study. That's something that a lot of the participants in my study told me, is that they have seen studies like this in the past, but they are spoken about, they are not spoken with. So that's something that I really wanted to put front and center at everything that I did. I also wanted to make sure that I was focusing more on the feelings, the thinking, the being of disabled students. I did not want to focus on the statistical outcomes. That's because I feel that statistics reveal outcomes of other issues, whereas the stories are going to reveal the influences that produce those outcomes. The last thing that I wanted to put front and center is a refusal of the medical model of disability. I strongly believe that disability is not located in a diagnosis. It is located in an identity and an experience, and a diagnosis is a privilege for many people. I did not want to exclude people based on privilege. So when I look at my demographics, I did have 4 graduate students and 4 undergraduate students. Most of my participants identified as women, non-binary, or trans-masculine. And I tried to make sure that a good variety of colleges within UT Austin were represented. As I mentioned earlier, I really wanted to make sure that when it came to race, that white people were not overwhelmingly represented. So most of the students I spoke with were Latina, Mexicana, Hispanic, Indigenous. So I think there's room for improvement there, of course, but it is a start that I did want to get moving to. For the actual analysis itself, I did semi-structured interviews. I did them all through Zoom, seeing as how I was conducting interviews at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. But even if the pandemic was not there, this still would have been done through Zoom to increase accessibility and inclusion. That way students didn't have to travel to me. Most of my interviews lasted about an hour, and then afterwards I transcribed and coded those, which again, I compiled into a list of institutional suggestions. Now, for my findings, it came down to 4 core themes. The first one being time and space, then moving into knowledge and knowing, access to care and accommodations, and then persistence and paving the way. For time and space, it was all about navigating the physical and temporal spaces of UT Austin. How do students interact with the geography of campus? With knowledge and knowing, that one was about adapting or not adapting to the expectations of higher education, and how knowledge is portrayed in an acceptable or an appropriate way. For access to care, a lot of the participants that I spoke with talked about how their intersecting identities influence the way that they are able to get the care that they need or want, the care that they desire, or even how they're able to avoid the institutions that are there to supposedly provide care. And then also when it came to their academic accommodations, how were those accommodations received by others within the institution, and how were they received as a student themselves? The last section, truthfully, was my favorite. It is all about persistence and paving the way, and that is about finding community. Cool, Patricia, thank you so much. And setting an example for students who follow. I did just get a notification that I'm at 10 minutes, so I'm going to move forward a little bit here. Now, with my findings, when it came to time and space, what I found is with the space, students were talking about the physical geography of UT Austin. And I don't think this is anything that's particularly surprising when it comes to the number of stairs or the building layouts that UT Austin has. But also that really intersects with time, because what a lot of students were telling me is that disability is unpredictable. And I feel that that's something that most people in the field know, but it's something that a lot of people outside of our field, particularly within academia, don't necessarily consider. So when it comes to the accommodations that students were getting and the deadlines that are set, there was a lot of talk and contention around that. And also where these two subjects intersect. So as you can see in that last narrative excerpt from Ash, they had to come to campus 2 or 3 hours before their classes to make sure that they could physically traverse the geography of UT Austin, because they had to find parking that was close to their courses. And if they waited any longer than that, they were at risk of not finding parking and not being able to physically move through campus as a person who had a mobility disability. With knowledge and knowing, the first quote that I have here is about how knowledge is portrayed. A lot of participants were talking about the expectations that are put on them by their professors, by academia, how they are allowed to show their knowledge and their passion for their academics. And that really goes into, I guess I could separate those two. Like knowledge, when I say that, I view that as how knowledge is portrayed, whereas knowing is how knowledge is felt and understood. So with the second quote there, it was a focus on poetry and how when Ash wrote poetry about their experience as a disabled person, able-bodied and able-minded people had a very difficult time understanding that. But when other disabled people read it or heard it or were exposed to their work, it resonated with them. And I think that that shows a really big disconnect between how knowledge is felt and understood within the institutions of academia and how it is felt and understood within individual disabled communities, not just within UT Austin, but across many different communities throughout the United States. So there was definitely a disconnect there. With the access to care, what you would notice in looking over these quotes is that identity really influences the institution that students will go to for addressing their concerns. So Erica here spoke about how her Latino background made it really difficult to get into the medical system for her mental disabilities because her family and her communities didn't take those types of experiences seriously. But also when she was exposed to that, the counselors that she was speaking to did not take her cultural background seriously. There was a disconnect there. And that made her very hesitant to reach back out. In the case of Sabrina, it was a situation of once she was able to get the accommodations that she had, professors were not willing to actually modify their courses for her. This resulted in her having to drop classes, miss assignments, and really change the way that she navigated the university academically. There's a lot more to say on that, but again, with the time constraints, it is difficult. With the last one, it's the academic persistence in paving the way. What a lot of students were telling me is that they found a lot of community with other marginalized people. So there was a lot of queer minority kinships that could be found. And one thing that they really wanted to do was make sure that as they're navigating UT Austin, they are following the example of those that came before them and setting examples for those that follow. Of course, I have a lot more to say on this, but I do want to be respectful of the time. So if there are any questions on this or any deeper insights, I would love to hear those during the Q&A section. Of course, that leads us right into here with some references, but that'll close out my time.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. Okay, so coming up, and yes, like I just want to remind folks, if y'all have any questions, please put them in the chat. And we will hopefully have time afterwards to check in. Okay, up next, we have Alexis Riley. So let me get, all right. Alexis Riley is a PhD candidate in the Performance as Public Practice program at the University of Texas at Austin. Her written and embodied scholarship explores the performativity of mental disability and its representation in the 20th and 21st centuries. Let's give it up for Alexis.
This is always the most precarious moment of any presentation for me. Okay, nope, see, wrong button. Can everyone who sees see the presentation? So my name's Alexis. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white lady sitting in front of a beige background with little more than shoulder length hair, big glasses, and big earrings. Before I begin, I would like to pause and offer an access invitation. First, I want to acknowledge that there are multiple meaningful ways to share in this presentation, so please engage in whatever way is most accessible to you. You may want to move around, stretch, stim, knit, eat or drink, leave and return, and so on. Access is a dance, and your improvisations are most welcome. I would also like to note that this project engages disability incarceration and violence against disabled people. I discuss these themes in brief, non-graphic detail. Please know that should you decide to disengage for any reason, this material is available to you in other, perhaps better, times and spaces. I have included a link to an access copy in the chat, and you can find supplementary materials as well as the full performance I'll be discussing at kin-song.com. Finally, in order to better attend to multiple forms of knowledge production, I have incorporated some embodied exercises into this presentation. These are private exercises and can be explored in a variety of scales, from large gestures to imperceptible micro movements. Please center what is safe, accessible, and comfortable, and know that you are welcome to participate or not participate as you choose. A video begins to play. Layered bodies painted in light appear, ghost-like, on the screen. Together, they move, reaching forward, twisting inward, rotating and rolling, their syncopated rhythms extending a sensuous call to long-forgotten kin. The dance is fragmented, punctuated by photographs and newspaper articles culled from the Austin State Hospital archives, projected over footage taken from a moving car traveling from Austin State Hospital near Guadalupe and 38th Street towards the Austin State Hospital Cemetery on North Loop. A line of 4 performers makes a similar journey in reverse, their angular arms and tilted heads literally remembering the boundary of the original State Hospital campus with each successive step. Throughout, the film blurs and bleeds, hitching forwards and backwards, speeding and slowing, mirroring the pleasure and pain of crip time, cast in historical relief. This clip is taken from a larger performance project I directed last fall titled Kin Song, Ode to Disability Ancestors. Created by a team of over 30 disabled and non-disabled artists, Kin Song served as a cybernetic seance crafted in response to the presence of over 3,000 disabled people laid to rest in Austin State Hospital Cemetery, their graves unmarked and remains unclaimed due to ableism. To be clear, this is no accident. In disappearing the disabled dead, the cemetery anticipates a particular future, one in which a grave marker would not be needed because there would be no one who would want to return and mourn them. They would be survived by no one. There would be no survivors. Through Kin Song, we sought to use performance to engage that once unthinkable mourning, and in doing so, testify that the futures that these sites imagined had not come to pass. In the face of disavowal, we sought to enact neuroqueer desire. This desire is the subject of my presentation. If disability has historically been understood as undesirable, as in feminist disability studies scholar Alison Kafer's terms, the sign of a future no one wants. What might desire, as both affective orientation and embodied practice, manifest? While the full accounting of the project is beyond the scope of this presentation, I will explore this question through an analysis of Kinsong's choreographic practice. Throughout, I frame performance creation as a kind of cross-temporal cartography. Moving through the city helped us to activate spatial and temporal layers buried beneath pavement and brick, working with the landscape to form affective attachments and cultivate relational practices of mourning. These techniques, I argue, cultivate what I'll discuss as neuroqueer desire. Taking the structure of Kinsong as a starting point for the format of this paper, the remainder of my presentation proceeds in 3 separate but interlayered portions. I focus on neuroqueer desire across 3 vectors: time, embodiment, and kinship. I begin with an overview, a love letter even, of a key term: neuroqueer. What does it mean to neuroqueer desire? What does it mean to desire neuroqueerness? The term neuroqueer is relatively new, developed by autistic and neurodivergent scholars who embrace autism, neurodivergence, madness, and disability as meaningful forms of human diversity with distinct modes of embodied expression. As queer autistic artist and scholar Nick Walker explains, humans are neurodiverse. We each have individual minds with particular ways of processing and communicating. However, some of those ways of processing and communicating are labeled divergent, their expressions policed. What these scholars name in language, our bodies already know well. Maybe you remember, as I do, the warm flush of embarrassed cheeks as the teacher shouts across the room, "I told you to sit still, I won't tell you again." The numbness of smashed fingers wedged into submission under crossed legs. The time spent alone in painful stillness as punishment for the report card that read fidgets too much. We learn early. It is important to pass as neurologically, quote, normal. These demands impact us all, regardless of identity, albeit in different ways. Here, I invite you to pause, and if it's available to you, more intentionally inhabit your body. Is there some movement that you are unconsciously suppressing? Some motion your body yearns for that might bring presence, comfort, joy? Can you invite that impulse into your body? Explore it. Let it linger. What feelings and sensations arise in its wake? Perhaps you have been passing too. Walker, drawing on the work of queer theorist Judith Butler, asserts that these demands to pass as neurologically normal, as neurotypical, are inherently bound up with gender and sexuality, and to this we ought to add race and ethnicity, among others. We may all be told to sit still, but what limbs cross where, how much space we take up, and what proximity we occupy in relation to others, these geographies are all predetermined. Thus, what we might understand as compulsory neurotypicality is inherently intertwined with compulsory heterosexuality. As a concept, neuroqueer enlivens me. Like queer, it describes a doing, and for this reason, it is well suited to performance. In Kinsong, moving through space in non-normative embodiments and investing in non-biological kinship structures amongst disability ancestors and their ascendants functioned as a way of neuroqueering time, embodiment, and kinship. 1. Time. Disabled people and disability scholars have written about the way disability functions in time. In my own work, I've been thinking about larger, transgenerational timescales as a way to frame institutionalization as a collective trauma that haunts disabled people in the present. Performance, as a time-based art form and mode of inquiry, is key to my thinking. For example, queer performance theorist Jack Pryor argues that in performance, past and present can often seem to converge, disordering linear time in a way that is particularly well suited to account for trauma. Scholars like Pryor build on theories that frame performance as citational. Just as one cites a paper, the body can also cite. It can quote gesture. These gestures travel through time, constituting a kind of embodied memory. For example, I often think about how I fold my towels the same way my mom folds her towels, the same way my grandma folds her towels. How many generations could I go back and find some remnant of the gesture, this domestic choreography taught to me as part of my gender training, in half again, then in thirds, 1, 2. Conventional performance theory would say that I have been interpolated into a genealogy of performance, one in which my gestures succeed my mother's, just as her gestures succeed her mother's, passing from ancestor to descendant. Performance, in this sense, is a kind of time travel, a way to touch the past. 2, embodiment. But lately, I've been thinking of other, more crypt temporal frames. What if I don't accept that the past has passed? What if instead of understanding gesture as past in sequence, I understand that gesture as constituted through accrual? In other words, what if those who came before don't disappear in the body, but rather remain? In this sense, performance, the quotidian gestures of everyday life, are embodied acts of co-presence. Here, I can revisit the choreography of the towel folding, feeling my way through the motion. Can I understand my maternal ancestors as moving with me, within me? 3, kinship. This reframes the notion of embodiment altogether. When we move as those who came before us once moved. I do not fold my towel alone. Rather, it is in the folding of the towel that I come to meet my mother, to perceive the spectral traces of my matrilineal line inscribed on and in my body. The folding is a dance of kinship. The movement is my mother. Our bodies keep many scores. And I'd like to offer that this is the case with autistic, neurodivergent, MAD, and disabled embodiment as well. Those moments of not sitting still, of hands waving, of bodies fidgeting, perhaps they are not the signs of an atypical body-mind behaving pathologically, but culturally significant movement practices far older than ourselves. They are our memory. They are our kin. And so, I'd like to invite you to return your attention to your body once more. Did you lose the movement from earlier? That's okay. You can always find it again. Call it into your body. Notice the motion. Perceive in your movement the presence of those who once moved as you do now. Desire the movement and in desiring the movement, desire your kin. Let the motion nourish you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexis. That was great. I really enjoyed the pacing and just like, I don't know, I felt like I took some good breaths there. Okay, we actually have some time for questions, comments. If anybody would like, if you can, please unmute yourself and or type it in the chat, whatever feels good to you.
I don't have a question yet, but I really just wanted to thank all three of the speakers. These were phenomenal talks to listen to. Thank you so much for sharing, all of you.
Thank you for being here. So.
I actually have a question for Mark. Mark, I'm really curious to know if the people that you were speaking with, if disability was the language they used to self-identify, if there was maybe diversity amongst that. And I also wonder if that came up in terms of like how you were crafting a call or thinking about reaching out to people, how language created particular forms of identification.
So each person that I spoke with told me that they identified as an individual with a disability. In full disclosure, I'm not entirely sure how to answer the second part of your question. Would you be able to kind of explain that a little bit more? I'm sorry.
No, I like said a quick question and then ran away. Like, yeah, I'm thinking about so maybe because I know part of the makeup of the people that you were talking to in the quotes that you shared identified with mental disability, and sometimes people who experience mental disability and distress choose different language to identify, or some people might prefer person first language or identity first language, so person with disability, disabled person. And so I'm curious how, if that came up in your process, because I also can imagine that if you're sending out calls and trying to connect with people, so many people with disabilities might not identify with particular language and then not respond. So I'm just so curious to learn from you and how you navigated that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you so much for kind of expanding on that question. That was super helpful. So when I was doing the call for participants, what I was doing is I was mostly reaching out to campus organizations that were for students with disabilities, that serve students with disabilities, regardless of how they worded it themselves. So some of the things I did was I had reached out to like Longhorn Ties, which is a campus support group for students who identify as being autistic. So I was reaching out to organizations like that, or student groups that were like that. That way I didn't have to worry as much about how am I going to kind of navigate the intricacies of that identity, and I would be able to go where students were already inhabiting. And then I also relied on word of mouth to like I would speak with one student, they'd be like, I know someone else, and then I would expand from there. I also reached out to a lot of classes that were focused on disability as a mode of study or as a mode of identity. So that was my main focus there.
Thanks, Mark. I think the work is so important, and I'm grateful.
Yeah.
I just want to read Martha's comment. Martha mentions, I'm not sure if this was intentional or not, but I love the placement of Izzy's reading after Alexa's. The intergenerational theme throughout both was so impactful. Yeah, thank you. And then also Kiefer agrees, and the power of embodied storytelling in response to such trauma. Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions, thoughts? I'm just going to leave it open. I'm not trying to make it seem too structured, but just to open up the space. I'm
Mark,
not sure. Oh, go for it.
I had a question, not expecting an answer, but just like something that I noticed in your presentation, I wasn't sure if it's intentional or not, is the switching between people with disabilities and disabled students.
I think that was not intentional. I think that may have, well, I know for certain that when I was doing that, I was trying to be mindful of that, but switching between that, I think was just an oversight on my part.
Okay, well, since we've been kind of like pushing it close on every other panel, we're gonna just pause here because want to give people some time to breathe and get some water. So please, if the panelists could share their email in the chat, and if you want to share your social media handles or people could find you, please do that to stay in touch. And I don't think I mentioned this in the beginning, but this is our conference website. So if you have any questions on where everything is, it's on the website. Oh, thank you, Bob. Oh, I said, my bad. Yeah. Thank you. And also, this room is going to stay open, and we're just going to come back at 4 p.m. And yeah, thank you. Let's give it up again for our panelists, Mark, Alexis, and Izzy. Thank you so much.